legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Steve Taylor, who joins us to discuss his book, Extraordinary Awakenings, From Trauma to Transformation. Extraordinary Awakenings is a compelling investigation of how intense psychological suffering can lead to a dramatic shift into a new, expansive identity. Why do some people who experience the worst that life has to offer respond not by breaking down, but by shifting up into a higher functioning awakened state? Perhaps more importantly, how can we emulate their transformations? Over many years of observing and studying the phenomenon of life-changing awakening through extreme suffering, Steve coined the term transformation through turmoil. He calls these people shifters and shares dozens of their amazing stories in his latest book. In addition, Steve uncovers the psychological processes that explain these miraculous rebirths after years of struggle or devastating loss, addiction, or imprisonment. He highlights a number of lessons and guidelines that the shifters offer us. Readers will find not only riveting stories of transformation that show the amazing resilience of the human spirit, but also hope and guidance to call on during their own struggles, together with inspiration and profound food for thought. Hello and welcome, Steve, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Hi, Greg. Great to be with you again.
Today, Steve, we're discussing your latest book. It's entitled Extraordinary Awakenings, From Trauma to Transformation. Before we dive into that, just give listeners a brief potted bio of yourself.
I am an author. I've written, I think it's, I'll have my 14th book, I think, coming out later this year. I write books on spirituality and psychology. But in the academic world, I'm a psychologist. I'm in the field of transpersonal psychology, which is essentially spiritual psychology. I'm also a poet. I've published 3 volumes of spiritual poetry.
Now, you have written, or taking the title of your book in mind here, you've written about the experiences of people who have suffered tremendous loss and trauma in their lives and have not only kind of come out the other side, but have kind of had their being elevated and transformed, literally in very profound ways. But this, as far as I know, is the first time you've brought all of this together and had stories from many individuals which you've gathered together and recount in the book. So what was the genesis of this? Were you learning about these experiences, writing about them, and then just thought, like, I need to put this into, a sort of a cogent volume because these stories are worth sharing?
Yeah, it's partly that. I mean, I've been writing about spiritual awakening and researching spiritual awakening for maybe 15 years now. So people have contacted me to say that they've had an amazing story of spiritual awakening. And I've done a couple of academic studies of spiritual awakening where I've encountered some really incredible stories. People who've suffered bereavement or addiction or even imprisonment, even, in the context of warfare. So people, I've learned that they can undergo this radical transformation of identity in a lot of different traumatic situations. So I wanted to kind of organize it a little bit and organize it into different themes and topics, different areas of transformation, such as combat, imprisonment, addiction, and so on. And I thought, there were so many amazing stories, so many kind of miraculous transformations that I really wanted to share them.
I suppose this has been a learning process for you as well in terms of research and psychological insights, even just the process of bringing all this together and reflecting on it and hearing these stories, I guess it's moved your own insights and thinking on in this area.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, one thing I've become aware of is the incredible resilience of human beings. You know, I did some research aside from the stories I've collected as a researcher. I did some research into transformational experiences in concentration camps in the Second World War, in the gulags in Soviet Russia. You know, so people who were living in the most extreme, brutal, horrific circumstances. You know, to the point where they were close to death from starvation or disease. But there were still many cases of this transformation occurring. It was almost as if, in Indian Hindu philosophy, they have a concept of the siddhis, which are kind of psychic or supernatural powers that arise in higher states of consciousness. It was almost as if, when people are in extreme states of deprivation, they occasionally spontaneously tap into these supernatural forces inside themselves. So it's almost like supernatural forces of resilience that sustain them in situations of deprivation, and also a kind of an inner radiance, an innate quality of well-being, even blissfulness, which can arise in extreme situations and help to keep a person alive. So yeah, it was kind of to me it was a journey into the amazing capacity for resilience and healing within the human psyche.
Now, a concentration camp of the type, for example, we saw with the Nazis during World War II, is a particularly traumatic combination of physical and psychological trauma. If we think back maybe a few centuries, let's go back to medieval times, when day-to-day life was a lot harsher, in physical terms. People may have shorter lives and more physical deprivation, suffering the extremes of the weather, perhaps not having enough to eat, etc., etc. If we contrast that with the late 20th, but particularly into the 21st century, the nature of disturbances and trauma that people suffer, it's so much diseases almost of civilization in a way. It's psychological. So many people suffer in their minds, even people who have not just their needs taken care of physically, but are actually very, very well off. There's a whole, there's a whole thing of the trauma suffered by the very rich as well. So it does seem to be that the disturbances of the mind are really what beset our civilization. Certainly in advanced industrial civilizations of the West, in the early 21st century.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's almost as if suffering has shifted up a different level from physical to psychological. It's a bit like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs applied to suffering. In the most in situations of deprivation, at the most basic level, you have the physiological suffering of hunger and a lack of security or shelter. And you move up the hierarchy, and you get more subtle, rarefied psychological sufferings, which in some ways are more, they're more insidious because they're more difficult to identify and more difficult to deal with. I mean, if you're hungry, it's very simple. You can alleviate your suffering by eating. But if you suffer from depression, if you're living a kind of fairly affluent lifestyle, but you're still depressed, it's more difficult to identify the source of your suffering. So it can be even more traumatic, because it lasts for a long time, and it becomes more intense as it progresses. But having said that, I think early human beings also suffered a lot of psychological suffering. Bereavement was very common. The death of children, for example, must have been incredibly traumatic for our ancestors. And also the kind of social suffering of being oppressed by a landowning aristocrat who owned your land and exploited and oppressed you. So, they definitely had some forms of psychological suffering too.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking of, partly at least, is I've written a lot and, done a lot of interviews centering around the idea of a lack of meaning and purpose, in modern life, and what negative effect that can have on us in our minds, and also therefore in our bodies as well, because as within, so without, the mind suffers, the body cries out. As I like to say, and there's almost these diseases of afflictions of affluence. That, you have your needs met, but yet our materialist culture basically advertises itself as, you get these things and therefore you will be happy. When you get these things and you're not, then I think that this is crisis of meaning kicks in, which is maybe something that didn't quite exist so much in the past. I know there were times of great material affluence. Even you go back to ancient Rome, there were people who lived with extraordinary wealth that you and I can only, imagine. But nonetheless, if you combine that idea of get these material things and that therefore, you can be happy that way. If you combine that with, something else I've written about a lot, technology and the alienating effects of that, technology and loneliness, you put all that together. I do think we are at a sort of a nexus of something that is unique to our time.
I agree. Yeah. So certainly to a large extent, I agree. Yeah, there is a certain point where you realize, it's a question of social values as well. As you say, our culture teaches us to try to find well-being in affluence and in seeking status and success and power and so on. But once you gain those things, you realize quite quickly, maybe you don't realize, some people don't realize and just keep trying and trying to get more and more. But some people realize that it's not working. And if you're lucky, if you have a degree of, intuition, you realize that there is another way. A lot of people do realize that there is another way to seek happiness, and that's to turn inside, to turn away from the external world, and to turn inside themselves and to follow a path of inner development. So I think a lot of people do realize that in our culture. I always think the Beatles are a good example because they became incredibly famous and incredibly wealthy. But by 1966, 67, they were exploring Indian, spirituality. They were learning to meditate. They kind of intuitively realized that there was another way, to find well-being. There was a truer path towards well-being. So I think that's maybe a positive sign of affluence, that a lot of people do turn inwards. And there's another thing I wanted to mention, which is that I think there's a type of depression which isn't so widely recognized, but is quite common in the contemporary world, and that's what I call spiritual depression. And that exists because our culture doesn't generally allow an outlet for spirituality, and there are a lot of people who have innately spiritual impulses, who have spiritual experiences, who've maybe even had a spiritual awakening, but because it's not culturally supported, and because they don't understand or accept what's happened to them, they repress it, which causes a lot of frustration, and it comes out in depression and feelings of anxiety. So that's one consequence of modern civilization. But I think spirituality is becoming more mainstream, and it's allowing an outlet for those kind of impulses now.
I think churches, the church, if we can use that expression. I know this is not one monolithic thing. There are different religions, and I'm thinking, I guess, of Christianity now because it's the only thing I've got first-hand experience of. They have not stepped up in the modern age. I think a lot of people just find nothing there. There's no, avenue of connection with the transcendent. I think a lot of people find, experience in a church, mostly mainline certainly to just to be meaningless. It doesn't speak to them. And I think a lot of religious leaders have become afraid to ironically enough, to actually speak about spirituality in a meaningful way. They're almost afraid of their whole reason of being.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are some positive aspects of religion. It can serve as a framework for spiritual development, but all too often it's conceptual, it's abstract, it involves, taking on a belief system. And, a lot of people are not able to do that. They're not able to take the step of taking on these concepts, taking on these mythic ideas, which are all too obviously, fallacious. But there is a growing movement of spirituality without religion, and that's where I think a lot of people instinctively sense that's where meaning and purpose may lie, in an area beyond religion, but which is still, which is still a landscape of spirituality, which they can explore.
Yeah, because in their original conception, the mainline, Abrahamic religions were trying to express something ineffable, which, is a kind of contradiction in terms, but, they were trying to articulate something almost beyond words. And then that got lost somewhere along the line. But that inherent need, as you say, you talk about this, emerging spirituality, that inherent need is still there. And that's what we see manifesting. So it's just that it's now happening without the bounds of mainline religion. But it says something that is happening. It indicates a need within us, doesn't it?
Yeah. And also maybe it indicates that the materialist worldview isn't working either. That people are sensing that the answer does not lie within materialism. Not materialism in the sense of consumerism, or that's related to it, but I mean materialism in the sense of believing that the physical world is all there is, and everything can be explained in terms of physical particles or forces. So I think people are sensing that materialism cannot explain human experience, or cannot really explain the natural world very well. And also that materialism is implicated in the ecological crises that we're facing. A lot of the environmental issues that we're facing stem from an attitude of disrespect and disconnection to the natural world. So I think people are seeking something beyond materialism as well, and they know that religion is not the answer.
Well, indeed, I'd refer listeners to your book, Spiritual Science, in this general area, and we did an interview around that, which is linked up on this interview page. So you're absolutely right. The materialist worldview is no longer tenable. It is breaking down. I think it's just taking a while to reach the mainstream in not only in science, but in society in general. The last couple of years, we've all been going through this pandemic situation, and that's had a tremendous toll on people's mental health. We've seen that. But there have also been some positives coming out of all that. I'm thinking now, and this really speaks to your idea of transformation through trauma, people questioning some of the fundamental assumptions about life, the universe, and everything as a result of being through these experiences.
People keep asking me, because I've got a background in post-traumatic growth, people keep asking me if I think the pandemic and the lockdowns have led to post-traumatic growth. And it's difficult to say, because post-traumatic growth normally takes quite a while to manifest itself, a year or two at least. But, my feeling is that a lot of people have gone through post-traumatic growth. I've met a lot of people who've said that they've reevaluated their lives, and a lot of people who've said that they've found meaning in simple things. They've found a kind of happiness through living quietly and simply, and just living, taking each moment on its own terms rather than rushing into the future. So I think people have relearned the value of simple things, and and also in general, I think people have learned that not to take things for granted so much, not to take life itself for granted, and not to take the people in their lives for granted, not to take their health or freedom, and the other aspects of their life for granted. Maybe that's manifested itself in what some people are calling the Great Resignation, which is, apparently many people are changing careers or giving up their jobs entirely. After the lockdown, they decided they want to do something different, something more meaningful in their lives. And that seems to be a lot. In fact, a lot of people in my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, that they said that after their transformations, they couldn't face continuing their lives as architects or designers or marketing executives. They wanted to do something different, something more meaningful, something more altruistic. So that is definitely a sign of transformation, and possibly a sign that the pandemic has led to growth.
Yeah, so your book is very timely in that way, because obviously, you didn't have the pandemic in mind when you were working on some of this material, but that came along, and it is a reminder really of of what to pay attention to, what's really important in life. And I think that comes across in a lot of the if not all, actually, the subjects in your book. Really, it would just, yes, they've managed to, elevate they survived the trauma that befell them. They've managed to come out in some kind of elevated sense of being. And one really important dimension in that is just don't, if you want to do something, don't wait. It's now or never in a way. And if not now, then when? Because especially the stories about bereavement and people suffering potentially terminal illnesses, it's like these things can happen to any of us at any time. You know, I'm not trying to sound morbid, but, you know, you or I could die tonight. You know, that it is possible. And of course, we don't go through life dwelling on these things, but I just think having that somewhere within your consciousness as part of a guiding principle is a good thing, because what's happened in a lot of the cases that you recount is that people were taken by surprise, of course, because we don't expect, most people anyway, don't expect bad things to happen to us, but you know, that can all change just like that blink of an eye.
I completely agree, Greg. I mean, you know, encountering death, becoming aware of the reality of death, is in itself often a transformational experience. You know, I spoke to a lot of people who'd been diagnosed with cancer, other people who'd attempted suicide, other people who'd come close to death as soldiers on the battlefield, and other situations. And, you know, it's so powerful. When you become aware that death is real, then you also become aware that life is temporary, fragile, and precious, as you said. And, you know, I think a lot of human beings unconsciously assume that we're immortal. Death is not real. You know, we unconsciously assume that we've got endless amounts of time to do what we plan to do. And we take things in our lives for granted because we feel that they're permanent. So when you realize that these things are not permanent, they're fragile and temporary, then everything changes. Then everything becomes, you know, valuable, and life becomes much more intense. And it's as if a veil falls away. It's as if a veil of familiarity falls away, and like, wow, you're living in this much more intensely real world, you know, where even nature itself looks much more beautiful and much more real. So a lot of people I spoke to, they talked about how amazing it was to live in this more intensely real world, where just to look at things, just look at the sky or trees or the blossom in their garden, everything was much more real, and it was as if they never really looked at these things before. So it's a kind of rebirth, but it's a rebirth into a state that human beings should always be in. You know, this is the way we should live. So it makes it clear that normally we're not living up to our full potential. We're living in a kind of half sleep, in a kind of daze.
Yeah, what you speak about there, way of looking at the world, it's almost like the psychedelic experience in a way. You know, people who have had such experiences often speak about, quite often it doesn't last that long afterwards, but they speak about coming back into the sort of quote unquote normal world and seeing things very differently because they had they gained this insight. And it also reminds me of how we are as children, really. I think children live in that permanent state of wonder, unless, of course, they unfortunately themselves have suffered any trauma or, you know, whatever that can happen. But in our natural born states, you know, I think that we're quite different to how we often become as adults. I mean, Joseph Chilton Pearce, I don't know if you ever read him, but he talked about, you know, consciousness, in different stages, and how up until age 6, it's one thing. And then at 12, you know, coincidentally or not, around the time, you know, of adolescence, consciousness changes again. And then another 6 years at 18 when we become adults, and it becomes kind of, fossilized in a way, you know, and a lot of people cease any kind of inner development when they do become adults. They go through the rest of their lives in a very fixed mode of consciousness, whereas I've always thought of life as a constant evolution, and I think that's what some of your subjects, you know, rediscover in a way, you know, is that we're not fixed and static psychologically. You know, we can literally change our minds.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com